A missing man surfaces in a Texas swamp. Strapped to his chest is a chilling record of his final minutes. Texas Rangers hope it will help unravel a case of double homicide. Police have a suspect in a cold-blooded killing, yet they lack the technology to match him to the crime. Will science catch up to the killer before he slips away for good? When a body appears on the side of a Texas interstate, detectives race to stop a homicidal trucker in his tracks. In Texas, there's plenty of room to hide. But killers in the Lone Star State should take warning. Even the swiftest criminals cannot outrun the long arm of the Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers were called to an abandoned car in a remote drainage ditch near Santa Rosa. The interior had been torched. A check of the plates showed the car belonged to Billy Staton, who along with his girlfriend Letty Castro had been missing for 10 days. It was the first real break in the case, and the Rangers desperately needed it. Once the car was pulled from the swamp, investigators noticed something even more disturbing. A rock had been wedged on the accelerator. Someone had clearly tried to send the vehicle into the ditch and destroy evidence of a crime. Fire and days of exposure to the elements had wiped away every fingerprint and destroyed any hope of linking the car to a suspect. The rock was the only clue left to lead them to the missing couple. If the condition of the car was any indication, things looked grim for Billy Staton and Letty Castro. Texas Ranger Bruce Castillo feared the worst. After finding the vehicle, search teams fanned out across canals and brushy areas, determined to find Letty Castro and Billy Staton. At that point, investigators believed the couple had been murdered. Rangers combed miles of dense brush along the drainage ditch. After several days of searching, they still had nothing. Yet the Rangers refused to give up. They had built their reputation on solving the toughest cases. Organized in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin to protect early Texas settlers, the Rangers earned their legend in the rowdy days of the Wild West by tracking bandits, bank robbers, horse thieves, and cattle rustlers. Today they remain just as tenacious, a highly trained state police agency skilled in investigative and forensic techniques. The Texas Rangers handle only the biggest and most complex criminal cases. What had begun as a simple missing persons report grew more difficult with every passing day. Rangers questioned Letty Castro's brother. He told them he had last seen the couple shortly before they vanished. When he stopped by the trailer Letty shared with Billy Staton. That was the same day the pair left to pick up Staton's 9-year-old daughter from his ex-wife's house. Billy and Letty were planning to marry soon and hoped to gain full custody of the girl. Their dreams ended the moment they disappeared. Rangers also learned from Letty's brother about the ugly custody battle. Billy Staton had rights to his daughter every other weekend, but his ex-wife Sherry often made pickups difficult. When investigators checked on Sherry, they discovered she and her new husband, Paul Wolf, had moved shortly after Billy Staton and Letty Castro vanished. When Rangers finally located the couple, they claimed Staton had never shown up to collect his daughter. Rangers obtained a warrant to search the home Paul and Sherry had just vacated. A damp spot on the carpet drew their attention. Closer inspection revealed a small area on the back of the carpet had been painted over. An obvious attempt to hide something. Sections of the carpet went to the lab. Technicians carefully removed residue with a cotton swab rather than risk destroying evidence. When a chemical that reacts to blood was added, the swab turned positive. The blood was human. Limits of 1980s technology and contamination from the paint prevented them from identifying whose blood it was, yet the carpet contained a great deal of it. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal it. Investigators found tiny spatters of blood on the walls and curtains as well. Samples were collected for later comparison if the bodies were ever found. Something violent had clearly happened inside that house. The most telling clue, however, came from what was missing outside. Criminalist Joe Marchand discovered an indentation beside a tree where a rock had once rested. When the rock from the car was brought back, it fit perfectly into the depression like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. Confronted with the evidence, Paul Wolf changed his story. He now admitted that Billy and Letty had arrived to pick up Billy's daughter. Sherry and the girl were not home. Billy grew furious and attacked Paul. Paul claimed he grabbed a metal bar to defend himself and accidentally killed Billy. When Letty heard the commotion and rushed inside, Paul said he struck her as well, again claiming self-defense. Shocked and terrified by what he had done, Paul asked his friend Glenn Henderson to help dump the bodies in a drainage ditch. To dispose of Billy's car, Paul brought along a large rock to weigh down the accelerator, hoping the vehicle would drive itself into the ditch. When that failed, he returned the next day and burned it. Paul Wolf insisted he had lied at first because he was confused and unsure the Rangers would believe his account. He then led investigators to the bodies. Letty Castro's body was found floating in a drainage ditch 12 miles from where the car had been recovered. Her skull showed the injuries Paul Wolf had described, yet she had also been shot in the head. The extra wound did not match his confession. Clearly, he was lying. Roughly 10 miles away, Billy Statton's body was discovered partially submerged in a steep canal. His head had been crushed. When the body was pulled from the water, detectives made a startling discovery. Strapped around his waist beneath his shirt was a mini tape recorder. The mechanism was damaged by water and mud, but the cassette inside remained intact. Rangers could not explain why Billy had worn a tape recorder to his ex-wife's house. Yet they recognized the possibility that he had recorded his own murder. The device was handled with extreme care. Crime scene analyst Joe Marchand contacted the FBI laboratory for guidance on preserving the waterlogged tape. The FBI instructed them to keep it submerged and ship it in water rather than risk the tape drying out and degrading further. After 10 long days, the tape returned to the Texas Rangers. The FBI had done everything possible to salvage whatever had been recorded. The moment it began to play, the sounds of Billy Statton's brutal murder rang out with horrifying clarity. Armed with the recording, investigators returned to the house and meticulously matched actions to the audio, measuring distances and timing events against the sounds captured on the tape. The blood found in the house matched Billy Statton. Blood stain pattern analysis added further detail. The spatter on the walls showed tiny tails resembling teardrops. By measuring the direction and angle of those tails, examiners could determine precisely where Billy had been standing or sitting when he was struck. Combined with the audio, the evidence painted a clear picture of that afternoon. Billy Statton arrived at the house and was invited inside. Sherry Wolf and her daughter could be heard on the tape, directly contradicting Paul Wolf's earlier claim that they had not been home. Shortly after Billy's arrival, Paul Wolf stepped outside under the pretense of taking out the trash. In reality, he wanted to confirm whether Letty had come along and to retrieve the crowbar he had hidden earlier. From the blood patterns in the tape, it was obvious Billy had no idea what was about to happen. He sat waiting patiently when Paul Wolf attacked. Paul Wolf's accomplice, Glenn Henderson, had been hiding in another room. Once Billy lay slumped on the floor, the two men went outside to deal with Letty, who was waiting in the car. Paul Wolf's self-defense story was a lie. These were cold-blooded attacks on unsuspecting victims. While the tape continued running, the killers carried Billy out to his car and placed him in the trunk. They knew they would need to dispose of both the bodies in the vehicle, so they took the rock with them. The fact that the murder weapons had been planted in advance and an accomplice was already present proved the killings were planned, not spontaneous. What the killers never planned on was capturing their own crime on tape. They drove to a secluded spot off a drainage ditch a few miles from the house. Glenn Henderson followed in his truck. The location was far enough off the road and the grass tall enough to conceal a body. But something went wrong. Letty Castro was still alive. The killers were prepared for that possibility. On the tape, a single gunshot rings out, followed by faint yelling, then a car door closing and the vehicle driving away. Approximately 30 seconds later, the tape ends. For reasons known only to them, the killers chose not to dump both bodies at the same location. They left their next victim 9 miles farther down the road. The car was disposed of exactly as Paul Wolf had described. The hardest part of the investigation was over. Back at the house, the conspirators faced a great deal of cleaning. In the short time they had left their victim inside, a large pool of blood had soaked into the carpet. They rented a professional carpet cleaner, yet even that was not enough. Blood had seeped through to the underside in a final attempt to hide the stains they painted over the spots. To put the crime behind them, the Wolves moved out of the house the very next day. Nothing they did, however, could erase the evidence Billy Staton had unwittingly recorded. Rangers later learned that Billy had warned the recorder on his lawyer's advice. He had hoped to document the hostile confrontation and Sherry's behavior in order to strengthen his custody case. Instead, he captured his own murder. Paul and Sherry Wolf were both sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Billy Staton and Letty Castro. Glenn Henderson received the same sentence for his role. Most criminals leave evidence behind that can condemn them. Sometimes, however, that proof is useless if technology cannot connect it to a killer. All investigators can do is wait for science to advance. Texas Rangers were summoned to a secluded farmhouse in Burleson County to check on an elderly woman who lived alone. Neighbors had been unable to reach her by phone and feared something was wrong. They were right. 72-year-old Lydia Schumacher had been murdered. Inside, Rangers discovered a gruesome scene. Schumacher lay partially nude on her bed, the sheets soaked in blood. She had been bludgeoned and then smothered to death. The Texas Ranger Crime Lab in Austin processed the house. Someone had broken in through the back door, and some jewelry appeared to be missing. It seemed Mrs. Schumacher had surprised a burglar. No fingerprints could be recovered, and the weapon used to beat her was never found. She had likely been smothered with her own pillow. Serologist Donna Stanley examined the scene and found clear signs the victim had been raped. She and her team carefully unraveled the bed linen sheet by sheet, preserving every hair they found. What began as a homicide investigation quickly revealed itself as a sexual assault as well. To find the killer, Rangers interviewed everyone in the area. Within days, they had spoken with all of Schumacher's friends and neighbors. No one could imagine who would rape and murder such a gentle, elderly woman. Eventually, 3 names surfaced, men neighbors considered suspicious for various reasons. Detectives asked each man to take a polygraph test. One by one, they were brought in, connected to the machine, and asked directly whether they had murdered or knew anything about the murder of Lydia Schumacher. Texas Ranger Bob Canales oversaw the case. Among the suspects were a next-door neighbor and a man later arrested for indecent exposure. 2 of the men were questioned and released. The third was a young man named Charles Soukup, Jr. Soukup and his father had been doing work at the Schumacher house on the day of the murder. A background check showed he had once been charged with sexual assault. Soukup was subjected to a thorough interrogation and denied any involvement. The polygraph confirmed he was telling the truth. All 3 suspects passed their tests, leaving Rangers empty-handed. With no further leads, investigators could only make the best use of the evidence they already had. At the crime lab in Austin, Donna Stanley and her colleagues tested the biological evidence left by the rapist. Once they determined the killer's blood type, they compared it to hair samples taken from the 3 suspects. 2 were immediately eliminated. Charles Soukup could not be ruled out. In those years, blood typing could narrow evidence to only one of 8 possible types. With hundreds of millions of people sharing Soukup's type, the results proved nothing conclusive. Still, it was all they had. Rangers brought Soukup in again. He had passed the first polygraph, but investigators believed that if he were guilty, he could not beat the machine twice. They learned he was currently in jail on a marijuana possession charge and therefore clean of any substances that might have affected the earlier test. A second polygraph was administered by the same examiner. Once again, Soukup passed. No other evidence linked him to the murder. Authorities had no choice but to clear him. For nearly a year, Rangers searched for Schumacher's killer without success. Eventually, they suspended the case. A rapist and murderer remained free somewhere in Texas, and the Rangers were powerless to stop him. Years later, science had advanced enough to justify another look. Serologist Donna Stanley had preserved what little evidence remained, hoping new technology might one day yield answers. The first comparisons between Charles Soukup's hair and body fluids from the scene had been inconclusive. Forensic examiners had exhausted every method available at the time. Since then, however, a revolutionary technique called PCR had been developed, allowing scientists to obtain DNA profiles from tiny samples such as a single strand of hair or a speck of blood, something previously impossible. Stanley was optimistic the evidence collected years earlier could finally identify the killer. Shortly after the case had been closed, Sheriff Canales retired. Texas Ranger Ray Kaufman took over, approved further testing, and quickly reopened the file. At the time Kaufman became involved, DNA technology was making rapid strides in narrowing suspects, and he believed this case might benefit. As the preserved evidence was sent to a genetics laboratory, Rangers began re-interviewing neighbors and relatives, hoping to learn more about Charles Soukup. They soon heard disturbing reports. Neighbors described Soukup's unusual sexual habits, including bestiality. The most helpful information came from a man who recalled a strange and frightening night with Soukup roughly 4 months after the murder. Harlan Golson was awakened late one night by Charles Soukup, who claimed car trouble and needed help. Something about Soukup's manner felt off, yet Golson reluctantly agreed to drive him back to his vehicle. During the drive, Soukup insisted on sitting directly behind Golson and spent the entire time idly wrapping an electrical cord around his hands. Soukup finally directed Golson to a remote area, but when they arrived, his car was nowhere in sight. Frustrated, Golson drove him to a garage instead. When Golson reached home, he still felt uneasy. He and his wife checked the property and discovered the phone lines had been cut. Later, when Golson showed Rangers the route he had taken that night, the significance became clear. The remote spot where Soukup had directed him lay near the Schumacher residence, down a small lane only a quarter mile from the house. Soukup had returned to the scene of the crime. Rangers knew it was common for killers to revisit their crimes. Yet this circumstantial evidence alone could not prove Soukup's guilt. The laboratory completed complex DNA testing, comparing Soukup's sample to evidence from the Schumacher case. The results confirmed that Charles Soukup Jr.'s DNA was present in the victim's bedsheets. The updated evidence finally gave Texas Rangers what they needed to arrest the man they had suspected for years. Soukup was in another Texas county jail on a vehicle theft charge at the time. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, Soukup confessed to raping and murdering Lydia Schumacher. In his statement, he explained that on the day of the crime, he and his father had finished work at the Schumacher house. They had spent nearly a week on the property, and Charles had been inside enough to notice Mrs. Schumacher owned gold jewelry. He assumed more valuables were hidden somewhere in the house. That night, Soukup returned. He had been driving around looking for something to steal when he thought of the secluded farmhouse and the elderly woman who lived there alone. Getting inside was easy. He had left a pipe in the yard earlier that day. Now it became the perfect weapon. Once inside, Soukup searched the bedroom. When Mrs. Schumacher awoke, he beat her with the pipe. Before leaving, he raped her and suffocated her with a pillow. It took years, but Charles Soukup Jr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Lydia Schumacher. The conviction stood as a testament to both Ranger persistence and the power of forensic science. Without advances in DNA technology, the case would almost certainly have remained unsolved. It is easier to catch a killer years after the crime if he stays in one place. Rangers take pride in tracking suspects on the run. In a state as vast as Texas, such situations are common. There is usually little to see along Interstate 35 between Dallas and Oklahoma. One day, however, that changed. A Cook County officer spotted a body on the roadside near the Oklahoma state line. When Texas Rangers arrived, they found a white male in his 30s who had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, neck, and face. A shoelace was wrapped around his neck, and a sock stuffed in his mouth. Judging by the condition of the body, he appeared to have been thrown from a moving vehicle. A bra and a baseball cap lay nearby, along with a pair of men's underwear. The clues were obscure, yet they were enough to set Rangers on the right path. Officers searched the body, but found no wallet or identification. The victim was transported to the lab for fingerprinting. The task of tracking the killer fell to Texas Ranger Johnny Waldrop. Within days, he received a positive identification. The victim was a 38-year-old Dallas man named James Sykes. Sykes had a long criminal history, struggled with serious drug addiction, had no steady job or family support beyond his parents, and was in many ways a person society had written off. Rangers cared nonetheless. Roadblocks appeared immediately. When investigators contacted people who knew Sykes, some asked why anyone would bother. Rangers made clear they cared because Sykes was a human being like anyone else. Sykes associated with a rough crowd. When officers located his best friend, Murray Bracken, he was in a Dallas County jail on a drug charge and became the first suspect. Bracken admitted he had been with Sykes the day before the body was discovered and confirmed the baseball cap found at the scene belonged to him. He insisted, however, that he had nothing to do with the murder. Bracken described how he and Sykes had been partying at a motel when they met a truck driver and his girlfriend. The four used up Bracken's drugs. At the end of the evening, Bracken asked the truck driver to pay his share. The driver said he did not have the money, but could go get it. James Sykes went with the couple to make sure they returned. The truck driver, for reasons Bracken could not explain, handed over his billfold containing his driver's license as a show of good faith. He said he was from Ada, Oklahoma, drove trucks, and had to be in Phoenix in a couple of days. He promised to come back with the money. The couple and Sykes never returned. Bracken emptied the wallet and threw away the driver's license, an act that later cost investigators a crucial lead. To test Bracken's story, Waldrop contacted the Oklahoma Department of Motor Vehicles and requested a list of truck drivers who had applied for duplicate licenses in recent days. One name stood out: Terry Brown of Ada, Oklahoma. Police records showed Brown had been stopped for a traffic violation shortly before the murder while driving a truck registered to a freight company in Carrollton, Texas. He completed his delivery and returned the rig. Soon afterwards, someone stole it from the company lot. Brown was later arrested driving the stolen truck and released on bond. Dallas police forwarded Brown's mugshot. Rangers placed it in a photo lineup and showed it to Murray Bracken. Within moments, Bracken identified Terry Brown as the truck driver he had last seen with James Sykes. The investigation gained momentum, yet Rangers needed more than one man's word to prove Brown was the killer. The freight company was relieved to recover its stolen truck. Unaware, it had now become central evidence in a far more serious crime. Trucking records confirmed Brown had been driving on business until the day before Sykes's body was found. Sometime after that, he returned to the lot and stole the truck. The company reported it missing. The rig was recovered the same day the body appeared. Dallas Police Crime Lab technicians searched the cab and sleeper compartment. They discovered small spots of what appeared to be blood on the walls and more blood beneath the mattress. Quick tests confirmed it was human. Detectives believed further analysis would show it belonged to James Sykes. The samples were sent for DNA testing. At the lab, criminalist Wilson Young performed the DNA comparison. What he found stunned investigators and created a major obstacle. The blood in the truck did not match James Sykes. Someone else might have been murdered inside that rig. Then Ranger Waldrop received word that another body had been discovered, a woman with a ligature around her neck and a sock in her mouth, exactly like Sykes. Waldrop's first reaction was that Murray Bracken had been telling the truth and that a serial killer was driving the highways. The Texas murders continued. Police in Richardson, just north of Dallas, found another body, a woman with a string tied around her neck and a sock stuffed in her mouth. This time, the victim was Terry Brown's mother. Brown and his girlfriend, Tina Sampson, became prime suspects. They had stolen his mother's car and disappeared. When Waldrop contacted Brown's last employer, he learned Brown was supposed to have delivered a load to California. Brown had picked up the truck the day before his mother's murder and never returned. Once again, he had stolen a rig and vanished. Rangers learned Brown had driven the truck to Oklahoma City, partied inside it for several days, run out of gas, and abandoned it. Oklahoma City police located the vehicle. Before Rangers could examine it, The trucking company hauled the semi back to Texas and had it professionally cleaned. Crime lab technicians searched the truck anyway. They found stains in the sleeper beneath the mattress that appeared to be blood. The stains were large and had seeped through the mattress onto the platform below. Yet this was a brand new mattress. The company had discarded the old one, taking potential evidence with it. Fortunately, the trash had not yet been collected. Among the discarded items was the old stained mattress. The large stains matched those found in the truck. Everything was shipped to a laboratory in Austin for detailed analysis. Technicians extracted DNA from the blood stains and chemically cut the strands into smaller fragments for precise comparison with James Sykes' sample. The fragments matched only one person in the world: James Sykes. The statistical probability was 1 in 5.5 billion. Terry Brown and Tina Sampson were located the next day. Dallas police stopped them in Brown's mother's stolen car as they headed east. The couple was separated and interrogated individually. Once confronted with the DNA evidence, they finally told the true story of what happened to James Sykes. To ensure they paid what they owed, Sykes had accompanied Brown and Sampson to collect the money. Brown drove to a truck stop and told Sykes to wait in the truck while he went inside for the cash. Sykes grew impatient. He climbed into the back and demanded sex from Tina Sampson. She panicked and pulled a knife to defend herself. When Brown returned and saw the two arguing, he assumed Sykes was trying to rape his girlfriend. In a rage, Brown grabbed the knife and stabbed Sykes. Sampson, distraught, took the knife and stabbed him repeatedly. Brown wrapped a ligature around Sykes' neck and stuffed a sock in his mouth. The couple left the body in the sleeper while they continued partying and using drugs. Days later, they decided to drive to Oklahoma City. Along the way, they pulled onto the shoulder of the interstate. Brown climbed into the sleeper and, using his feet, pushed the body out the side door. They then continued to Oklahoma City. Although investigators could not secure convictions for the other two murders, Tina Sampson received 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder. Terry Brown was sentenced to life in prison for the death of James Sykes. The determination of the Texas Rangers had paid off. This case exemplified what Rangers have done for generations. There is an old Ranger saying, "A man in the wrong cannot stand against a man in the right who keeps on coming." That is exactly what happened here. The Rangers kept coming. More than a century ago, the Rangers earned their reputation by stubbornly pursuing criminals across every kind of terrain with whatever weapons they had. They are still at it today, now armed with the power of forensic science. Killers may continue to run from the law, but with technology as their ally, the Texas Rangers will never stop their relentless pursuit.